Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Cyberpunk Holiday, and this is the Comics Journal issue 100. This is going to be part one of a couple parts. We're going to go through this whole thing. It's 244 pages. Obviously, I'm going to cut the fat. I'll take out what I don't think really needs to be talked about. I know that's subjective, but we'll just stick with the important bits. The first bit is the opening statements by Gary Groth, how the journal has been, scrutinized for being too elitist on the subject of comic books and holding its standards way just too high to where nobody could possibly meet it. And as we all know, that's probably not true because Love and Rockets is on the cover here. And as we know, Gary Groth thinks the world of Los Bros Hernandez, as do I, as do anyone who's read Love and Rockets. So anyways, I actually pre-recorded the reading of it before this, what you're seeing and hearing now. So I'm just going to record this and I'll turn the page when I see it's gotten to that point. And essentially, if maybe you could see and follow along, maybe not. But I really, this is just going to be for the people who care about Gary Groth's statements on the world of comic books. And he kind of preaches about that and speaks to that in the opening statements. Anyways, I don't want to keep you rattling on forever here. So here we go. This is going to be another call to arms by Gary Groth in the editorial. I am probably the least sentimental person I know, which may account for why, until recently, and only at the prompting of my coworkers, I hadn't realized that journal number 100 was something of a milestone. I have, after all, been editing the magazine for 74 issues and for nearly 8 years. This represents a significant portion of my life. I am not an autobiographical writer, and I can barely understand the conceit such writing requires, though in certain instances I'm thankful for it. Still, this is the perfect opportunity to reflect upon the journal and its editorial position, and at the same time answer a few questions that readers still seem to puzzle over. No one can talk about the journal without invoking the single term most often used to describe the magazine, both pejorative and approbation. In other words, elitist. The journal's dreaded elitism is probably the single most reviled element of the magazine. Conversely, the journal's emphasis on artistic standards, aka elitism, is also probably a single element that sets it apart from every other magazine about comics. A magazine devoted to applying vigorous standards to comic books is a paradox. The comic book form is a child of mass culture, and the function of mass culture is to render the application of artistic standards irrelevant, to cause such intellectual confusion and disarray that shared values have been replaced by an undifferentiated mass of helter-skelter opinion. It doesn't take an uncanny perception to see that the journal's editorial position is implicitly at odds with many of the fashionable trends in comics, though it takes considerably more wherewithal to see beyond that superficially to understand the magazine's commitment to the ideal that comics is an art form that must, if the form has defined itself, be held to a more mature, intellectual, emotional, and artistic standard than it has in the past. I do not expect and do not get much sympathy for this point of view from mass market comic producers, from publishers, editors, or even creators. It's been my observation that most mass market comic producers have swallowed the shallow and expedient values of a consumptive culture whole, and that these values, easily digestible and banalizing in effect, have been internalized to the point where these manufacturers of art, or entertainment as they prefer to call it, create formalized work, a kind of generic commodity, like Jell-O, devoid of imagination, ideas, and individual expression. Among those from whom I get a sympathetic response, the Will Eisners and Harvey Kurtzmans, the Jules Pfeiffers and Robert Crumbs, there is a common denominator, a respect for mature creative work and an indifference or outright contempt for the demeaning infantilism of the mass market comic book. There's clearly a real schism between these views and those of your typical comics reader. He may be 14 years old or an adult married with children, but their tastes are both quintessentially escapist in nature. They both see art as a distraction. They have both been taught to choose their entertainment by the same method they choose their dishwashing detergent. By the color of the box and the price tag. Oof, that's a burn, man. Sorry, he didn't say that, but this is back to Gary Groth. I get into trouble for saying things like this, and since I hold these views, the magazine trends to appeal less and less to this type of dominant comic book consumer. Recently, I attended a seminar during which I gave a brief talk to comic shop retailers. One retailer, a reasonable sounding and concerned looking gentleman, told me that customers who bought the journal from him would come back and tell him the magazine depressed them. No retailer wants to sell a magazine that gives his customers headaches. This leaves me in something of a quandary. How do you edit an intelligent and exacting magazine about a medium that has been so consistently manhandled by its producers that its most appealing characteristics are its stupidity and simple-mindedness? The answer is to either make the magazine less intelligent and to increase the pander factor, or to ignore the criticism. I have chosen the latter, and at some financial peril to myself, simply because comics don't deserve to be trivialized. That's true. The objection to raising standards in comics comes from practically every quarter. It comes from retailers who do not sell many comics of the kind I hold up as superlative examples of the medium, and for whom standards mean nothing anyway. It comes from publishers who have trained their audiences to be as indiscriminating as possible. It comes from creators, most of whom would be looking for new jobs where anyone to impose standards on their work. And it even comes from readers, victims of a ruinous educational system as well as their own culture. The most virulent, as well as the most intelligent, articulate, anti-intellectual in the comics fields is probably Denny O'Neil, whose objections to value judgments and standards of whose defense of the status quo should by now be legendary. His objection to me in particular was voiced in Marvel's Epic magazine, issue number 18, in his Media View column, and his objection is instructive. O'Neil was reviewing Videodrome and couldn't account for the fact that he and a bunch of fellow Marvel employees he saw the movie with couldn't agree as to how much they all liked the movie. According to O'Neil, none of his peers in the comics community practically ever disagree, which may account in large measure for the homogenized product Marvel turns out. O'Neil wrote, this is the quote, "Next, possibly, our tastes are vastly different. Not true. I work often and generally well with most of these people on artistic or at least quasi-artistic projects. We get along. We don't hassle. When someone mentions a book or television show or, yes, movie, there is usually a quick consensus. Although I've done a bit more public opinionizing than most of my lunchers, I don't think my standards are substantially at odds with theirs. We're not Plato or John Simon or Gary Groth, especially Gary Groth. We don't have Olympian, unattainable standards. And we enjoy genre fiction in general and movies in particular, and therefore we're more likely to approve than to disapprove. O'Neill goes on to write, it's no secret that the fastest way to recognition in the reviewer dodge is to trash something a lot of people like. Preferably wittily, scathingly, and with a suggestion that, of course, readers share the writer's hugely perceptive sensibility and can recognize how insulting it is to even be subjected to the Philistine garbage that those bores in the media foist. John Simon could tell you Rex Reed, Gary Groth, ? But that is a game of polysyllabic punks. This is back to Gary Groth. I assume O'Neill substituted Rex Reed for Plato because the writer of Iron Man was not arrogant enough to call Plato a punk. Quoting, there are some elitists who comic book writers can assault in the pages of epic. Plato is probably one of them, unquoted. There is, to O'Neill's tirade against elitists, a shucks, ma'am, gee whiz, I'm just regular folk posture I find unctuous, false, and condescending. Thank God. In the face of such hollow tripe, we have critics like Simon who are willing at least to lay themselves on the line time and time again and challenge us with their standards. I happen to have known O'Neill so long that I can remember a time when we agreed on one or two things. And I can hardly bring myself to believe that O'Neill even believes the things he says here. Does O'Neill really believe that media moguls are actually sensitive and intelligent men who have nothing but the public good in mind? Or is it more likely that network executives, movie producers, comic book publishers, etc., are the Philistine bores that the critics who O'Neill ridicule suspect they are? Surely O'Neill knows that someone like Simon doesn't achieve the recognition of reviewers like Siskel and Ebert. I don't agree with that, but jovial middlebrows, who play the audiences with a studied pretense of standards. Okay, I agree with Gary there. Rex Reed, it seems to me, should be more to O'Neill's liking. Anyone who appears on The Gong Show should be unpretentious enough to suit O'Neill's taste. And surely O'Neill has known me long enough to know that my standards are hardly Olympian and eminently unattainable. But this is a popular misconception. When he interviewed me for Comics Interview, David Anthony's Craft's first question was, why do you hate comics? In other words, anyone with standards must hate comics. Anyone who edits a magazine that condemns as many comics as the journal does must hate comics. Off the top of my head, I would opine that the journal praises as much as it vilifies. I would even go as far to say that the journal praises far more than it condemns and goes out of its way to praise and recommend books. But why must we condemn at all, is the question I hear from everyone. Ezra Pound, who makes John Simon and me look like populists, answers this more forcefully. This is a quote. The man of understanding can no more sit quiet and resigned while his country lets its literature decay. And let good writing meet with contempt than a good doctor who could sit quiet and content it while some ignorant child was infecting itself with tuberculosis under the impression that it was merely eating jam tarts. It's very difficult to make people understand the impersonal indignation that a decay of writing can cause men who understand what it implies, and the end whereto it leads. It is almost impossible to express any degree of such indignation without being called embittered or something of that sort. That was the end of it. Not that the journal is necessarily filled with men of understanding, but this is the condition to which art may lead us. A paragraph later, Pound says, a people that grows accustomed to sloppy writing is a people in process of losing grip on its empire and on itself. And this looseness and blowsiness is not anything as simple and scandalous and as abrupt and disordered syntax. It concerns the relation of expression to meaning. Abrupt and disordered syntax can be at times very honest, and an elaborately constructed sentence can be at times merely an elaborate camouflage. Back to Groth. Denny O'Neil may tell us that this is pretentious or unrealistic or irrelevant. It's all a little too high-minded for comic books. When Pound talks of the looseness and blowsiness of art, his reference to a slackening of standards and the relation of expression to meaning, his words are irrelevant to the world of comics. The very fact is shameful. Yet it is undoubtedly greeted with relief by those who must meet the deadlines and crank out the cliches, and by the readers who have been carefully weaned away from good writing and precise expression by the preponderance of comic books they read. The other answer to Pound is the typically modernist response to any advocacy of standards, an adroit and popular combination of cynicism and nihilism. It doesn't matter. Comics don't matter. We may as well add, unless someone is willing to argue that comics are not a part of our lives to lesser or greater degree, that life doesn't matter either. Trying to persuade people that an art form generally considered as insignificant as comics does matter can be a little like butting your head against a wall. And believe me, my head can hurt as much as anyone else's, maybe more. Having made a case for standards, I'm about to make an admission that should set Denny O'Neil's hairs on edge. Sometimes I feel a little like the novelist poet Thomas Love Peacock's description of John Stuart Mill. When a friend asked Peacock, "When I know Mill well, shall I like him? Will he like what I like and hate what I hate?" Peacock replied, "No, he will hate what you hate and hate everything you like." It can be difficult hating what everyone else likes. This is an exaggeration, of course, but my point is that holding standards is one thing. Advocating them is quite another. Every time you advocate standards, you place your head on the chopping block. You can lose friends and make enemies because of what Pound calls the critics' impersonal indignation. So sometimes I wonder if I'm not too damned elitist. The world of comics is insular, and it's difficult to gain perspective. The absence of standards and the de-escalation of artistic values doesn't help. Even friends whose intelligence and judgment I respect and whose tastes I'm often in accord with come down on me for being too critical, unreasonably critical, or just walk away shaking their heads, knowing nothing they could say can change my mind. One journal writer recently lectured me on the importance and value of the Comics Buyer's Guide, a paper that I consider resolutely Philistine in its editorial point of view. More often than not, I am astonished at the sheer junk intelligent and otherwise tasteful people will like, and the kind of excuses they will come up with for liking it. A writer who I very much like personally and admire professionally recently asked me, "But don't you think there's a place for mediocrity?" As if there is a certain quota of mediocrity that is sacred and free from criticism or censure. I'm constantly admonished by friends who write and draw mainstream comics, whose intelligence or talent I respect. It's difficult to admire both quantities in the same person, there apparently not being an adequate supply of both for everyone. That the standards by which most journal critics assess comics are simply too high. Most creators, even the most respected among the mass market comics, consider themselves commercial artists. And here we hearken back to the differences between high culture and mass culture, which usually ends up meaning that they are not aesthetically or morally responsible for the work to which their names are signed. In other words, the comic critic is in a catch-22 situation. Either he uses his own cultivated standards, invariably considered too high-minded and stuffy by editors, publishers and creators, and therefore irrelevant, or he uses their standards, which are the non-standards of the mass market, which is irrelevant to the thinking man. As the editor of the journal, I have to choose the preferable irrelevancy, and I'll choose the former every time. Whereas judging art, commercial or otherwise, by the standards of mass culture is irrelevant to everyone. Readers who prefer this kind of reviewing are probably impervious to education anyway. Maintaining standards, even in the world of comic art, is relevant to the few who really care deeply about the medium. I agree with Gary Groth there, by the way. Something I read recently in the British fanzine BEM, which now I get the title to that Love and Rockets #1, maybe. That was a side note, but let me start over with that. Something I read recently in the British fanzine BEM by correspondent Bernard Leake may serve to lend perspective to my editorship of the journal. It was, in fact, one of the most penetrating analyses of the journal that I've ever read, and I'm deeply indebted to Mr. Leake for writing it. His relevant observations are these. Jesus Christ. This is the last page here. So these are Leake's words. The journal is a polemical magazine devoted to excellence in comics and trying to forge itself and its readers into a mighty instrument for raising standards. Gary Groth rather disingenuously announces that there is no party line in the journal. Anybody's contributions will be considered on their merits. This is disingenuous not because Gary is a vicious bigot who rigidly excludes ideas with which he disagrees. R. Fiore is a regular columnist of very different mind and approach, and maybe he isn't publishing John Clifton articles as a joke after all. The problem is that muscular standards raising activity requires some kind of focus, some general agreement on what a good comic is. And there isn't any such agreement in the pages of the journal or anywhere else. I think it was in his editorial entitled Explosion in a Cesspool that Mr. Groth admitted to holding a minority taste and pleaded for recognition of the obvious difference between comics, which was really trying, and those which are merely trying. Obvious to John Clifton, it isn't, or if it is, he sees it irreconcilably differently. All this desperate effort, all the acres of newsprint devoted to defending a territory of good comics and consigning the bad ones to the everlasting bonfire, when nobody can offer any visible criteria by which to distinguish them. The frenzied concern with purity, the interminable efforts to construct and maintain, like the fourth bridge, a canon of works of accepted excellence, are all symptoms of a lack of direction and of the absence of a community of discussion. Why is it like this? Why do quite sane-sounding people like Richard Marshall believe that the comic strip and the comic book have an unrevealed, enormous potential without being able to say what it consists of? Nobody wants to cut the toad's head open to see how valuable the jewel inside is. They'd rather keep raising the current estimate. Can it be, oh my, that there isn't a jewel there at all? I suggest that Mr. Groth doesn't impose an editorial line because there isn't one available to impose. And he is sensible enough not to construct artificial substitutes like, you write what you like and I'll print my version. No more than the humblest reader of G.I. Joe does he have a vision of comics as they might be. Only a refined and painful awareness of what he wants them not to be. E.g. Secret Wars, as an example. It's not enough. A general theory of comics such as has been produced in many conflicting forms, of course, for literary genres like novels and epics, is necessary before any dreams for the future can take on a definitive shape and positive content. If someone doesn't like any particular theory, he can supplement, modify, or replace it. But until one appears, all criticism of comics will be floating in the void, unsupported by anything more than a consensus of some readers' uncontrolled intuitions. So that was the end of Leak's part. We go back to Groth. I don't agree with all of this, but I marvel that it was written at all. American comic fans are comparatively unmindful of such issues. Leak is mindful that a shared system of values has been supplanted by disorder, but his call for some sort of holistic, theoretical exegesis on comics art indicates that he doesn't know how deeply rooted the problem is or how impregnable to change it really is. Chaotic standards is part of the modern condition, the result of high culture and its unified system of values being diluted and denatured by mass culture, effectively erasing the shared understanding of the cultural community and turning art and culture into a single homogenized glop. The confused state of affairs to which Leak refers is nowhere more pronounced than in comics. The shared values of comics are the non-standards of mass culture. Trendy kitsch is the most highly valued commodity among comics publishers. It's amazing how very little the attitudes towards art have changed among comic publishers, editors, and creators over the last 20 years. Over the period of time, in other words, when comics became conscious of their place in the culture hierarchy and attempted to exploit their status as a legitimate pop art. Comics were first discussed as an art form in the mid-1960s in Bill Spicer's magazine, Graphic Story magazine. I discount the early EC fanzines because the discussion was less sophisticated and narrow in scope. There was a growing awareness among comics critics, historians, fans such as Spicer, Mike Barrier, Bob Stewart, John Benson, and Richard Kyle that comics were an art. Prior to this time, there were virtually no press on the subject, and most of the creators saw comics, if they thought about it at all, more as a craft than an art. Kyle expressed his view succinctly and reasonably when he wrote in 1967 that no medium, in my view, is inherently incapable of expressing truth. No medium is manifestly trash. This view, a liberating statement for its time, so cogent and indisputable to my mind, is largely irrelevant to professionals today who think not of art but of entertainment of the most perfunctory level, or whose views of art have been so conditioned by exposure to mass culture that art and trash are one. Art has now entered the vocabulary of comics professionals, but mostly as a euphemism for highfalutin junk. A respected independent comics publisher recently told me exasperately, after I had spent several minutes bewailing the trash that publishers and creators have made of the art form, "Look, if I want something deep, I'll read a book." An implicit admission of prejudice towards the form that is identical to prejudices held by publishers in the 40s and 50s. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the best creators were the exception. Cole, Barks, Kurtzman, Eisner, Kirby to some extent. But it was the great mass of junk that had its effects on the publishers and editors today. It's not the work of Eisner, Kurtzman, and Barks that have shaped the values of today's creators, though a decent amount of lip service is paid to the old masters as a matter of course, but the junk. Publishers proudly carry on the Grub Street tradition of comics publishers of the past, and creators are only too eager to modernize kitsch of the past and supply the necessary product. As the editors of a critical magazine about comics, I publish writers who I think serve the cause, who respect good work, disdain the bad, and whose convictions about art and historical familiarity with the art form lead to critical judgments that help the readers define or refine his own values. The journal's advocacy of standards will not therefore appeal to the great mass of comic book readers who couldn't care less about it. It isn't meant to cater to their tastes or encourage their slipshod consumerism. It is published for the dwindling minority of comics readers who believe comics don't necessarily need to serve as a distraction from life, but an enhancing part of life, and who want to be alerted to the politeness of the form. The tidal wave of trash may bury us all, but until that day arrives, the journal will keep butting its head against the wall. Gary Groth. So very quickly, why am I doing this? Why am I reading the journal? Specifically, number 100. The reason being is because I started reading it. I was reading Gary Groth's statements, and then right after, as you see, it has the Marvel withholds Kirby's art, which we're gonna do in part 2 of this video, plus other stuff. It just has it's a substantial look back at the history of some things that were going on in comic books at the time, and I think that it's something good to share. I actually bought this for the Love and Rockets cover, and it was $35 online, and I just started thinking about it, and I was like, well, why don't I share some of this with the channel? And so that was opening statement by Gary Groth, pretty much his statement on the Comics Journal, its history, how people felt about it, and basically his overall perspective on setting his own standards for comics. If you basically, it's not elitism. It's just that he's setting standards that he thinks that are practical to comics, and that the big two like Marvel and DC they don't care, as long as they make a buck, they don't care. So anyways, I don't want to rattle on again, as I said before. I just want everyone to know why I'm doing this. There's going to be a part 2, maybe a part 3. We'll see. So yeah, thanks for watching Cyberpunk Holiday. Like, share, subscribe.